built on and modeled after a number of other programs in the country. So chances are, wherever you are on the campaign trail, you're going to find an organization that is almost a duplicate of ours that's providing services to keep people alive on a daily basis. So I want to thank you for being here. I also want to thank all the journalists and media folks that are here today, as well as all the campaign staff. I also want to acknowledge our sponsors and our funders that have been facilitating the work that we've been able to do this fall and will continue doing throughout the campaign season. So this today is our rescheduled kickoff to our Democratic candidate presidential candidate forum series. So this is our first event, and we'll be hosting a number of other events over the next few months with individual candidates in order to have conversations with folks about what the overdose crisis means to them and its role in the presidential campaign. In particular, I want to acknowledge the Drug Policy Alliance, the Harm Reduction Coalition, and AIDS United. And so I want to welcome each one of you here, but I'll give each of our discussants review, and we're also very excited to hear a little bit about the policy platform that you released this morning. So my name is Sarah Ziegenhorn, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition. I'm also the founder of our organization, and then by night or by day, I'm also a fourth-year medical student at the University of Iowa. And so I've been working in meal exchange programs and harm reduction for about a decade, starting in Washington, D.C. at a meal exchange program there. And I came to doing harm reduction work for many, many reasons. That's too long to get into, but I stay very engaged in my work, and it gains more meaning to me all the time, primarily in part because of its impact on my personal life. In March of this year, I lost my fiance to a heroin overdose, and he also is someone that had worked here at Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition as one of our case managers and kind of the backbone of what this organization does. So through a lot of the work we do, we're able to honor him. So that is a little bit about me. Do you want to introduce yourself, Keenan?
Sure. My name is Keenan Crow. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at One Iowa, which is a statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. I also serve, though, on the board of directors here at the Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition. I sit on the membership committee, and I also volunteer with the organization as well. So, and guide some of the policy discussions that we have done.
I'm Aaron Pinky Whitus. I'm the debut program coordinator for Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition. I use him or his pronouns. So I came into harm reduction from personal use with heroin addiction, and lots of friends have died from heroin addiction, so it's really personal to me. But I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for being here.
I'm Andrea Weber. I am an assistant clinical professor at the University of Iowa, where I function as basically an addiction treatment specialist, work primarily with people who use drugs. I'm also a board member for the Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition. I came into harm reduction kind of later on in my career, learning a lot and participating in this organization. A lot of my patients, a lot of people that I care about deeply are very active and have had a significant impact on our organization, so which fuels me to stay involved and to help kind of also push our legalizing treatment options for people who participate in our program.
Great. Good to meet you.
So yeah, we'd love to hear a little bit more from you about why you're here today and why you're investing so much focus in campaigning and addressing the overdose crisis.
Yeah. Thank you for hosting us and welcoming us, and also to each of you for introducing yourself and sharing your stories and the people with whom you work and on behalf of whom you work. And Sarah, my first question for you was going to be, why are you doing this, and what is your personal connection to it? And I'm sorry to hear about the loss of your fiance this year, but it helps me to understand how personal this is for you and why you're doing this, in addition to being a fourth-year medical student and everything else that's on your plate right now. And even in this very brief tour, we were at the storage bins where there are all these supplies that are dispensed to clients and people who walk in, and you both made the case in terms of extraordinary savings that we realize when people have access, but also just to the lives that are being saved when people have access. And so whether we're compelled by the moral dimension of this or the fiscal dimension of this, it's the right thing to do. And I'm very grateful that you're doing this work. And it's to ensure that substance use disorders, substance use overdose becomes a priority in this country, and not just something that we talk about, but something that we act on. And that the actions that we take are informed by the great work and leadership that you're providing right here. That's literally why we're here, to make sure that we continue to improve this plan, and that we're working with and guided by the leaders on the ground in communities like this one and those all across the United States, including my hometown of El Paso, Texas. And there's essentially 5 tenets of our plan. The first, and perhaps criminal justice problem, but as a public health opportunity. And I love the very candid and frank and real way that you spoke. I immediately felt comfortable when I came in here. I can imagine any new client or someone who's never heard of the coalition before who walks in the door will feel the same way. And that may be somebody who is wrestling with that stigma or that fear or that anxiety, or the very real concern that they may be justice involved if they come forward. And I feel like so much of that is put at ease here, but I think as a matter of federal policy, we need to do the same as well. The second is making sure that we have the resources for treatment and for long-term recovery. We proposed a $100 billion substance use fund to make sure that we're addressing all of the challenges and the opportunities that are contained within these set of issues. And most importantly, stop the epidemic of deaths that we're seeing in the United States of America. There's a very real urgent crisis, and we need to make sure both from the policy and from the resources that we're making sure that people have the help that they need. You mentioned, you showed me a box of naloxone, and what did you say it was with copay?
In our state, it can cost up to $150 copay. Yeah.
Which may just put that functionally and effectively out of reach for people who need it. So making sure that naloxone is available. Following the lead we've seen in other states. We were in New Hampshire, and in some cities in New Hampshire, there are safe stations. You can go to a fire station in that city. Naloxone's there without a charge, without law enforcement being involved. Really, no questions asked. Just making sure that the person who needs help is able to get help. Third tenet is accountability. Those who have helped to create this crisis and bear some responsibility for ending it must be held accountable. And so whether it's Purdue Pharma or Johnson & Johnson or the makers, distributors, and marketers of these opioids, we know that so many people who are struggling with substance use disorders began with a legal prescription. And that drug may have been marketed to the provider or the prescriber without that prescriber knowing some of the unintended consequences, because that information is withheld by some of these pharmaceutical corporations. So making sure that we look at the entire supply chain and hold those who are responsible accountable is, I think, the best chance of changing the course of this challenge in our country, and that will be a priority for us. I want to make sure, fourth point, can also still successfully integrate in the economy. And we know that so many who have a substance use disorder, who've been justice involved, who've been incarcerated, who once released have a very hard time being able to even be able to apply or successfully get a job. The fact that you have to check a box showing that you have a criminal conviction sometimes can preclude employment going forward. So banning the box to begin with, and then investing in job training programs, creating 6 million apprenticeships over the next 10 years, making sure that there's that skill, that trade, that education, that purpose, that function, that dignity in your life. I think all of that is important to meeting this challenge. Last point, fifth point, is those who are struggling with chronic pain. We want to make sure that there is a still a legitimate way to be able to to be prescribed an opioid where it makes sense. And I hear from a lot of people who are anxious that any of us who are working on this are going to diminish their ability to get the appropriate treatment for the pain that they have in their life. So I think working with prescribers, with scientists, with you and others who are working on these issues, I think we can meet that challenge and that demand as well. So those are the big 5 points that we're proposing in our plan today. But to come back where I started, really where you started, I really want this to be a human and a humane policy. I want it to be informed, guided, and driven by the very people who are working on this, the very people who are working through a substance use challenge in their lives. And so that's what has brought us here today. So really look forward just to listening and hearing what you have to say. Very happy also to answer any questions that you might have. But looking forward to what you have to say. So Sarah, thanks for bringing this all together.
Thank you. And we're really grateful for your plan and the work that you're doing on this issue. We're also really grateful for the way in which you're placing people who use drugs at the center and the heart of your planning process and elevating people with lived experience, but also people who are working on the ground in communities who see how this work affects people on a day-to-day basis. And so I want to start by talking with you a little bit about the third part of your plan that's focused on addressing the overdose crisis by asking for justice from pharmaceutical companies. I think a number of your colleagues who are also running for president have put out similar proposals that ask for these companies that have manufactured and led to in some ways, overprescribing of opioid medications. Many folks have asked those companies to come to the table and come to the courts, not the table really, and to pay out quite a bit of money. And some people are not so sure that that really looks like justice, right? So even if those companies are penalized, I'm certainly never going to see hundreds of thousands of dollars from those companies to pay retribution for the pain that I've experienced. Same with Pinky. Those are dollars that are not necessarily going to come into our communities. But they also, it is a strategy in litigating against those pharmaceutical companies that's focused from a place, it's a very liberal sort of policy focus, right, in which you say that pharmaceutical companies are the bad guys and we need to target them in our work. What I think is lost in that particular focus is the pathway in which many people who use opioids came into their drug use and the root causes of why people use drugs. And so in trying to develop some questioning for you, I asked my friend Monique Tula, who's the executive director of the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And so for her language, I'd like to borrow from her. And so she'd like to talk with you a little bit about root causes and to dive more deeply into where the current overdose crisis truly came from and wondering how that we are going to address the social and economic structures that contribute to the overdose crisis, perhaps greater than any one pharmaceutical company or group of physicians prescribing an opioid like OxyContin. So I want to talk a little bit about overdose, capitalism, and the broken social contract. So drug overdose and suicide are cited as the primary reasons behind the longest sustained decline in life expectancy since 1918. But there are additional factors that play into this phenomenon of what some call the deaths of despair. So that includes economic insecurity, eroding civil rights, intergenerational trauma, and dissolution of families caused by mass incarceration. According to economist Guy Standing, a new social class he calls the precariat is the result of broken social contracts driven by the rise of a global market economy. He says that people in this social class live in economic uncertainty, usually in chronic, unstable debt, where one mistaken decision or illness could tip them over the edge into the underclass and likely condemn to social illness or even an early death caused by overdose or suicide. These trends are strangely accurate predictors of whether or not someone embraces a populist rhetoric in the current administration. Beyond penalizing drug companies and expanding access to treatment, what are the societal values we must change to bring health and racial equity for a new social class that we have created through economic insecurity and eroding civil rights? And if elected president, where would you begin? So I'm wondering, addition to this question, probably can move beyond the important and necessary role of holding pharmaceutical companies accountable, but begin to address the causes and the reasons why people use drugs in the first place.
Yeah. As you just said earlier, it's so important that those who are using drugs are in the conversation, and in that conversation are the ones that we're actually listening to and leading the conversation. And so I want to say with some humility for me to presume that I know why anyone has a substance use disorder. That doesn't seem all the way right to me. And so I want that to be informed by those I listen to. Having listened to a lot of people around the country, a lot of what Monique says rings true to me. When I travel to communities, smaller communities, whose purpose, the organizing principle for that community, it could be the factory or the farms or the point of pride that everyone grew up recognizing, for that to be diminished or withdrawn or gone altogether, for the community hospital or clinic to be closed down, for the school population to be dwindling to the point that it's closed down. I see and feel real despair in those communities. And as a community, a lack of purpose and functioning. And why are we here, and why would any young person come back, and what are the young people here going to do? You mentioned a criminal justice system that is in some ways defined by the injustice that so many people experience through it. 2.3 million behind bars right now, and I alluded to this earlier, but even those who are not currently incarcerated but have been incarcerated, unfortunately in this country, we force them to define themselves, or we define them in some part by their conviction and their incarceration. And in some ways, one describe them by the worst decision or thing that they've ever done in their lives. I think that can breed or lead to despair. If you're working 3 or 4 jobs just to make ends meet, and any one of those jobs pays a maximum of $7.25 an hour, I think that need to have dignity in your working life, beyond the fact that you are just scrambling to make ends meet. You're not spending time with your kids. You're not enjoying a life that you should be able to. I think that's a contributing factor. Crowdsourcing treatment for diabetes or curable cancers or the flu. We know that that's all too common in this country right now. And then one group of Americans that I'd love to bring to this conversation, that I've done a lot of work with, veterans who've come back from serving this country. Some have described service in Vietnam 50 years ago, in Afghanistan yesterday, as one of the most meaningful, purposeful, essential things they could do. What they did or failed to do would determine whether they lived or died, or those in their unit would live or die. And then to come back sometimes to a country where that service is not understood or respected, where they don't get the care or treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I cannot tell you how many veterans I've met who've been prescribed an opioid. The VA, in its kind of ham-handed way, cut off their prescription without an alternative therapy or remedy, and they are now medicating through heroin on the streets. Not criminals in my mind, people who need the help that they've earned and that they deserve, and who are lacking integration back into civilian life that provides that purpose and that function that they knew as part of a military unit. I think all of these are challenges, and all of them, I think, have fixes. I think ensuring that no one has to work 3 or 4 jobs, but that one job is enough because we have a minimum wage that is a living wage. I think ensuring that the balance of power, which clearly favors corporations today, is reset in favor of working Americans and farmers and families and communities, and an economy that is focused at the human level instead of the corporate level. Healthcare that is a right and not a function of privilege or circumstance or luck. could do a lot of good for a lot of people, especially those who, in my home state of Texas, very often get locked up on purpose because the county jail is the largest provider of mental health care services today. So people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and clinical depression literally getting locked up because it's the one place that they're guaranteed care. So I think you're absolutely right. Monique is absolutely right. That there are much deeper underlying structural systemic challenges that we face as a country that if we do not address, as helpful as it will be to hold the pharmaceutical corporations accountable, as helpful as it will be to focus on harm reduction, on decriminalizing substance use, and on investing in treatment and long-term recovery, we will not have got at the core challenge that we face. So love the point that you made and agree with it.
I have the next question, and we're going to be talking about a similar kind of public health issue that's also important with another one of our collaborators, which is AIDS United. So for those of us in medicine and public health, we were all too aware of when Scott Price sounded the alarm when they experienced an unprecedented increase in HIV among people who use drugs in their community. At that time, Indiana law prohibited syringe service programs from operating, despite substantial public health data proving that they drastically reduced the spread of infectious disease among people who use drugs. The then Governor Mike Pence claimed to oppose syringe services on moral grounds, claiming that they support and encourage drug use despite substantial evidence proving these claims to be false. Pence was eventually convinced to suspend his unscientific ban on syringe service programs, but not until more than 200 people who use drugs had contracted HIV. In December 2017, the CDC actually sent a letter to our governor, Kim Reynolds, warning her that the conditions in our state were ripe for a similar cluster to appear here, given the rise of both heroin and methamphetamine use in our state. As an addiction physician, I know that the value of needle exchange programs extends beyond HIV prevention. No person who uses drugs can effectively be treated for a substance use disorder unless they choose to do so and have the support to do so. But for those individuals who do desire treatment, syringe service programs can be a place where people who use drugs are able to access treatment services and where people may be quickly assisted even to getting accessing treatment on demand in that moment. So, Representative, there are still 13 states that do not allow syringe service programs to operate, including Iowa. This past September, your home state of Texas authorized funding for a pilot syringe service program in San Antonio, which will be the first in the state's history. As president, what will you do to ensure that sound public health policy is implemented in states like Texas that have traditionally been resistant to harm reduction programs and push for nationwide legalization of syringe service programs? And once legalized, what will you do to help support the adequate appropriations to these syringe service programs?
I think you just made the case that when the science is that clear, when the facts are that obvious, then no state should be able to exempt itself from being able to care for its citizens and prevent the kind of deaths that you just described, which are totally a product of these kind of politics of fear and paranoia and anxiety. That if we take a humane public health approach, we are somehow going to encourage drug use or reward quote unquote bad behavior, which I think has really been such a part of the conversation for far too long in this country. And so you ask, as president, what would I do? I would make sure that these syringe services are a federal priority, are extended to every state, and in our federal health care plan, Medicare for America, we make sure that this is something that is a national standard and from which no state can exempt itself. And I think we also have to do what you just did for me and for everyone who's watching, which is you know the facts, you know what is true, and to be correct, we just got to share that with everyone else. I think when the larger public understands that as well, you then have much greater popular support and political will to do the right thing, to work with members of Congress to make sure that they can see beyond the 50-year-old talking points about the war on drugs and now do the right thing for people. So I'm grateful that you brought that up.
Yeah. And one follow-up too,
Yeah.
just in the same mindset. So, as president, would you be in favor of lifting the ban on them using federal dollars so they can be used in order to purchase sterile hypodermic needles and syringes for these syringe programs?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have the next question. One of the ways that I work with the LGBTQ community and my work intersect is on the ability to destigmatize and decriminalize the transmission of HIV. So we know that these two things are extremely connected, and that there is an intersection between reducing transmission of HIV and eliminating overdose deaths. So currently we do have medications like PrEP that enable somebody living with HIV to have sex with their partner with less fear of transmitting that virus. We do have an entire generation, though, that possesses the ability to grow up and grow old knowing that not only does undetectable mean untransmittable, but that their HIV status doesn't determine who they can or can't love. So at the same time, we have scientific and public health know-how to cure people who inject drugs of hepatitis C while also ensuring that they have the necessary tools to safely administer drugs. Simultaneously, gains we've made in HIV prevention among people who inject drugs are threatened. So HIV transmission from injection drug use now accounts for 10% of new infections within the U.S. The science is behind us, but so is, unfortunately, the unrelenting stigma surrounding HIV. So 26 U.S. states still criminalize HIV transmission. That does include Iowa. Now our statute has gotten a little bit better since I started working here. It used to also criminalize whether or not you could prove that you had disclosed your HIV status. There was an extremely draconian punishment that kind of accompanied that, which was 25 years in prison and an extended period in the sex offender registry. Now we've removed that kind of disclosure statute, but we still have a criminal transmission statute on the books. And many state Medicaid programs also refuse to provide hepatitis C treatment until an individual has significant liver damage and is completely sober for a period of time, which is not tenable for a lot of folks. Many state sex offender registration and notification laws also include registration requirements for individuals convicted of HIV-related crimes. And most recently, in our neighboring state of Missouri, Michael Johnson, a black gay man, was originally sentenced to 30 years in prison for his HIV status, and was released by the Missouri Court of Appeals for the Eastern District, and which described that case as fundamentally unfair and the 30-year sentence as grossly disproportionate. So as president, what are you going to do to eliminate policies and regulations that stigmatize people who use drugs and people living with HIV? And how will you ensure that those communities are meaningfully involved in your administration?
Like much of what we have discussed today in terms of the policy, the goals, and how you build the political will in the community to actually accomplish them, I think the effort needs to be led by those who are living this. And in Sarah's phrase, the lived experience has got to inform the public policy. And so I love that you brought so many specific stories to bear in the question that you asked, to remove the stigma of HIV, the criminal consequence or penalty or fear that so many live under. And then this to look at the positive, this extraordinary opportunity with PrEP, which you may know the numbers better than I do, but I think when used as prescribed, has an up to 99% efficacy rate, and yet only 10% of Americans who are at risk of having HIV are using PrEP right now. And I think it gets back to Sarah's point about naloxone. Why do we make this so expensive? And then if you look at the perspective of the American taxpayer, we invested in research and development for PrEP, the clinical trials for PrEP. We buy PrEP through Medicare, Medicaid, federally insured employees. We have a massive investment in PrEP, and yet PrEP here is sold back to the American taxpayer at the most expensive rates on the planet. You can buy it for a fraction of what it costs here in America in other countries. And then there's the public health cost and consequence if we fail to make PrEP available. It's far more expensive. Outcomes are not as good. And so, again, whether it's the moral imperative, which is what compels me, the right thing is right in front of us, just do it, or whether it is the fiscal or fiduciary duty that we have to one another as taxpayers. It is very clear that an investment in making sure that PrEP is truly available to everyone who would benefit from it. It makes all the sense in the world. As president, I will make sure that is the case. Removing the stigma, the criminal consequence, ensuring that people are focused on living to their full potential, being well enough to do whatever they were put on this planet to do in the first place, just makes all the sense in the world to me. And I think also, last point, these gross miscarriages of justice, where you have somebody who I think you said was originally sentenced to 30 years in Missouri. There's no perfect analogy, but Amber Geiger, white police officer, killed a black man in his own apartment and got 10 years for that. A third of the time that there's something completely out of whack. And when you have people who are locked up for possession of heroin or for dealing marijuana, which is legal in most states in the country, and Sarah's really good point about the underlying issues notwithstanding, you have no executives of these pharmaceutical corporations who paid any significant consequence whatsoever. Then you have a real miscarriage of justice on a broader level in America today. So yes, let's focus on this public health opportunity and reduce the criminal justice fear that so many people live under right now. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
I think it's a really perfect point to spin next into getting into more detail about criminal justice reform. Unfortunately, we have one panelist who is going to be with us this morning, and we would have loved you to meet. Chris Brown is an outreach worker with IHRC, and so beyond the walls of this office, he's out in the community working with people who, despite as anti-stigma as we believe that we are, as welcoming as we believe our harm reduction services are, we know that because of the fear of criminalization, there is no ending stigma without decriminalization. And so folks are not going to come to our office, hands down, no matter what, as long as drugs are criminalized. So Chris does a lot of work out in the community. Chris also changes the color of this conversation, and very rightfully so. As for white folks who are sitting here talking with you, we're not necessarily the folks who should be bringing this message to you. And so I'm sorry that Chris isn't able to be with us. So I'm going to skip over one of his questions, and I want to turn to Pinky to talk a little bit more about criminal justice reform in detail.
So drug war policies have targeted women exclusively through DHS and Child Protective Services programs and policies. But I would like to talk now about the war on drugs more broadly. In particular, I'd like to talk about the role of law enforcement, surveillance, and mass incarceration in drug policy. Despite spending more than $1 trillion on the war on drugs since 1971, all we have to show for it is the world's largest imprisoned population, most of whom are locked up for nonviolent drug offenses. The highest global demand for non-prescription drugs and the rate of addiction have remained steady when that started. Some advocates are demanding that the National Harm Reduction Strategy that includes increasing access to meth, access to naloxone, SSSPs in all 50 states and territories, eliminating bans on housing and education for people with drug-related offenses, and other policies that end the individual and structural violence caused by the failed war on drugs. What strategies and policies will you put in place to begin deconstructing the prison industrial complex, including releasing people with nonviolent drug-related offenses, improving access to SUD treatment and recovery support, and creating opportunities for people to gain a sense of purpose, community, and employment?
Thanks for the question. So maybe starting from the biggest picture to some of the specific policy questions you asked, I would end the war on drugs, which we know has really been a war on people, and to the point that Sarah made, a war on some people more than others. We know, as you pointed out, that the majority of those in federal prisons, for example, are serving time for drug offenses. The majority of them are people of color. We know, I was just in Montgomery, Alabama, at this legacy museum that talks about 1877 to 1950, this period of white terror in America. And at the end of the museum, you get to read the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, with the exception of those who have been convicted of a crime. And how there are some in this country, by color of their skin, who are literally down by law. And it's reflected in that prison population, the largest on the face of the planet, and the quote-unquote crimes for which people are serving time. I made the case earlier, it's not just the fact, the indignity that if you're black, you're more often stopped than if you're white, that you'll be more likely to be frisked, arrested, incarcerated, but even after incarceration, forced to check a box on employment application forms, unlikely to qualify for student loans or a small business loan, or really be able to fulfill your potential in life. And I just want to say all that to make the case, as you did as well, that the war on drugs has not only not achieved its aims, but it has harmed a lot of people in this country unnecessarily. So ending that war on drugs, and to your question about those currently serving time, using my powers as president to grant clemency to those who should not serve another day behind bars, to expunge the arrest records for those who have already served time so they can get along with their lives. And then we were at a round table in California, specifically about cannabis and marijuana, and someone said, Beto, I hear you and others talk about restorative justice, but as a black woman, she said, what are you restoring me to? What period in this country's history was there a justice system that worked for me? She said, what about transformative justice? And I love that phrase, so I'm taking that from her. And one of the examples of transformative justice that we saw in California, in fact, we saw this in Oakland, a man who had been arrested for selling marijuana and cannabis was first in line to be able to get a license to legally sell cannabis. And so kind of calling out the fact that black men and women disproportionately have served time for drug use and drug sales in this country, and white people disproportionately are making a killing as cannabis becomes legal across the country. There's injustice even in that, and it's not enough to say we will stop frisking and arresting and incarcerating black men. It's more important to say we will also do some of the repair necessary for the injustices that we've committed. So I think that's an important step. Ending for-profit prisons in America and for-profit immigrant detention centers. There should be no profit incentive to deprive somebody of their liberty. And I think the fact that it's connected to the bottom line of these corporations helps to explain the 3 strikes and you're out, the mandatory minimums, all of the screwed up things that we do, or many of the screwed up things that we do in our criminal justice system. I would end cash bail, which essentially says that some people are too poor for justice in this country. And I think that's an important step for us to take. And then decriminalizing the possession and use of drugs in this country. We've already addressed that, but I think that's fundamental to making sure that we no longer approach this as a criminal justice problem and instead see this as a public health opportunity. And then last thing, Sarah and some of you have mentioned your involvement in this issue. More than 10 years ago, I worked on the El Paso City Council, and we worked on this issue because our sister city, Ciudad Juarez, had become the deadliest city in the world, bar none. And Pinky, it was to your point, the United States represents the largest market for non-prescription drugs on the planet. We're 4% of the population. We're 24% of the planet's consumption. Mexico is right next to us, and through those plazas or markets in Ciudad Juarez, you had kids who were literally willing to die or to kill other kids for the privilege of bringing marijuana across into the U.S., as well as heroin and meth and other drugs, but marijuana was the cornerstone crop. So with a city council colleague, I wrote a book called Dealing Death and Drugs that talked about our perspective on one of the front lines of the war on drugs at the U.S.-Mexico border. And in that book, 10 years ago, came to the conclusion that we had to end the war on drugs, end the prohibition on marijuana, and take some of the really important public health and public policy steps that you all have outlined here. So this is something that I've long worked on and been concerned about, and am encouraged to see over the last decade so much progress and movement in the right direction. We're nowhere close to being there yet, but I think it's cause for some optimism, and so very grateful that you asked the question on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I like that you say that we're not close to being there, and I have a friend and colleague, he's a reporter and a writer and a researcher named Dr. Siegel, and he equates the war on drugs to the war on terror, and saying that these are both wars that are never ending. There's no proof that they worked. We've spent trillions of dollars on them, and it's widely recognized that there's no end in sight to either. So I want to push you a little bit further on ending the war on drugs. And I know that you, along with many others, will say drug use is not a moral failing. It's not a criminal issue. It belongs in the house of public health and healthcare, where it should be rightly managed in community settings versus as a criminal issue. But given that, how do you plan in your administration to address the fact that the DEA receives a massive amount of federal funding while we direct comparatively much less funding to IHRC, to SAMHSA, and to CMS? How will you commit to defunding the DEA and restructuring the federal government to walk the talk of ending the war on drugs?
Absolutely, and I feel like much of the answer to your question is contained in your question. Our budget is a function of our priorities, and this focus on the war on drugs going on 50 years in this country not only has deprived other federal agencies and departments that can be far more effective in addressing some of the underlying causes that Monique had asked about in her question, but it's also militarized our communities. I talk about a war on drugs being a war on people. You talked about its connection to the war on terror, never-ending war. Some have also called it the new Jim Crow, which through criminal code and through law enforcement keeps communities of color specifically down by law. And I mentioned the shooting of Botham Jean by a white police officer last year, the shooting of Tate Jefferson 2 weeks ago in Fort Worth in her own bedroom by a white police officer. We know of the extraordinary number of doors that have been broken down, of the almost military-style weapons that DEA and local police departments and sheriff's departments are using around this country, as we kind of as we have militarized a challenge instead of looking at it from a public health aspect. So, moving resources from DEA, from breaking down doors, and from targeting communities, and specifically communities of color, to addressing underlying mental health needs, substance use needs in this country, and in the process saving potentially hundreds of thousands of lives. If we just look over the last decade and hundreds of thousands of lives lost, there was a policy solution to that. It wasn't an act of God or a force of nature. It was a human-caused problem, and there is a human solution to it. And I think we're beginning to describe what that solution looks like. And so not only must it be reflected in the policies we enact, but in the budgets that we propose. And I would certainly invest significantly in SAMHSA, in Centers for Disease Control, in our proposal, Medicare for America, that ensures that people get the care and the help that they need. And to stop looking at this so punitively and through the lens of criminal justice, which, by the way, not only hurts our country. I mentioned Ciudad Juarez being the deadliest city in the world at that time. It is deadly again right now. You see throughout the Western Hemisphere this war on drugs that we have forced on other countries that have hollowed out their institutions, and it is not unconnected to tens of thousands of people coming here from Honduras, from El Salvador, from Guatemala, from Mexico, in large part because of our consumption, which you mentioned, Pinky, and also because of our interdiction and incarceration first approach. So, a lot for us to correct and get right. The upside is that there are a lot of great people committed to doing that.
I think that you're right that we do see this driver of people coming into the U.S. because they're fleeing violence that is an effect of the war on drugs in countries like Mexico, and that's why the president of Mexico has committed to investing in decriminalizing all substances, and so it's his position that all drugs, not just marijuana, should be decriminalized. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to drill down a little bit further. You have said specifically that you would decriminalize marijuana, obviously. Given the success of, Portugal and other European and some South American countries in decriminalizing other substances like cocaine and heroin, how are you going to go about ending the war on drugs without decriminalizing additional substances? Recognizing, of course, that there are a number of different models for decriminalization and room kind of under that umbrella for a number of different policies and ways to accomplish that. But I guess in short, are you willing to decriminalize other substances? And if not, what evidence supports your view on keeping those criminalized?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer that you alluded to is there's a lot of work that goes into that.
Absolutely.
And a lot of models that we need to look at around the world to find out what has worked and what has not worked. I would make the distinction with marijuana because we go well beyond calling for its decriminalization. It should be legal in America for the medicinal value that it provides. And I mentioned some of those veterans that I've talked to who've been prescribed opioids. Very often they said, I wish I could have been prescribed cannabis. Instead, I've met doctors at the VA who say, I wish I could prescribe cannabis, but I am prevented by federal law from being able to do that, although that is my best medical opinion that cannabis would be the appropriate treatment for this patient. I met with those who are struggling with chronic pain, who are at end of life, who have to illegally buy marijuana right now. I remember being at a town hall and a woman pulled me aside and described what it's like to live with fibromyalgia and how the drugs that she's legally prescribed leave her in a fog and make life almost, in her words, not worth living. But that when someone introduced her illegally under Texas law to cannabis, it absolutely changed her life for the better. That should be legal, but so should recreational use for adults. I think it gives us a far better chance of ending its sale in schools. And as the father of two middle school kids, and middle schools being one of the fastest growing markets of marijuana today, because it remains in the black market, I want to make sure that we do a far better job of preventing use amongst young people. So I think, looking at the example of how we restricted and controlled the sale of tobacco, the public information and public health campaigns that we invested in that reduced use amongst young people, I think there's an extraordinary opportunity there with marijuana to gain the best of the positive uses of that substance and to reduce the harms, including use by young people and including mass incarceration. When it comes to heroin and methamphetamines and cocaine and other substances, it should be decriminalized so that if someone is found in possession, they don't have to fear arrest or incarceration, so that if they want to come forward to this location here or any place where they're going to be able to get help in the country, they don't have to fear the injustice involved. It means that they're more likely to get the help that they need. It means it's more likely that we're going to be able to save their lives in many instances. And it means that we have a more humane policy that I think we could be proud of. I think there's a lot of work that has to be done in addressing the supply of those substances in this country. And I've seen evidence that suggests that if you were to decriminalize the entire supply chain, you may actually exacerbate the problem. So for the end user, I think it needs to be decriminalized. For those who traffic in, deal in, these non-prescribed illegal drugs, I think we have to take a more thoughtful approach and understand how we're going to stop the transit, the traffic, the dealing in these drugs. And I think that's a much tougher and honestly more complex set of issues. But hopefully I got to the part of the question that you asked.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer.
So I want to turn and talk a little bit more about some of the other parts of your team. And we've been talking a lot, obviously, about ending the drug war, about decriminalizing substances beyond marijuana. But I want to talk a little bit more about our context, which is in some ways similar to Texas. We're a very rural state, and so there are unique solutions that are needed to address the overdose crisis in our state, particularly with regards to treatment. So I want to turn to Pinky and then Andrea to talk a little bit more about rural challenges.
Right.
Yeah. So many plan to address the overdose crisis and end the war the war focus on metro areas or the U.S. at large, without taking into consideration the unique context of rural communities. However, there are growing disparities in rural communities impacted by substance use and overdose. Not rural white communities, but all rural communities, including those with large population of migrant workers and people of color. What hope does the plan you are releasing today offer to small towns and rural communities? How does your plan ensure that people who live in small towns and in the country also have the resources, support, and policy changes they so desperately need?
I want to just interject really quickly. I wonder if you can, because your questions are so interlinked, I know we're running low on time, and I want to make sure we have time for one additional question after this. If you can add your question on to Pinky's.
You bet. So once again, knowing that rural communities often are hit harder by, or have been hit harder by the opioid crisis in studying that they have less access to prescribers of treatment as well as just treatment access. We have 3 FDA-approved medications that have been proven to be very effective, if not life-saving, for people with opioid use disorders in particular, including methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. Methadone in particular can only be provided by opioid treatment programs, which are federally regulated. In states like Iowa, they are very difficult to find. They often can have wait lists. They remain cash pay on a daily basis. And oftentimes, in order for people to maintain a functional life, they may have to get up at 4 in the morning, drive 2 hours to take their medication in the morning, and then somehow manage to get to work, take their kids to school.
Yeah.
Buprenorphine in particular is available in an office setting for prescribers who need to get extra training. They have to ask for special permission from the DEA to get a special waiver to utilize that training. And it's been made more available to prescribers, but it still remains very difficult for people to access. And then even when people are able to prescribe, there's the issues of whether their insurance will cover it, the regulations that put in place by insurance providers, especially in the state of Iowa, especially for people with Medicare and Medicaid. So kind of in that context, due to the demand for more prescribers for buprenorphine in particular, given that it can be given in an office-based setting, particularly in rural areas, many medical organizations and national associations of prescribers have advocated for actually removing the special X waivers, as kind of a term for it from the DEA. That includes the extra training physicians must complete in order to treat patients with opioid use disorders with this medication. How would you deregulate these medications in order to ensure they are able to be prescribed by a licensed physician in a safe way?
Thank you for the questions, and I'll just take them both. And I like what Sarah mentioned that there's Texas and Iowa in this sense. In Texas, we've seen in many rural communities, hospitals and clinics close down. They just literally cannot afford to keep the doors open. And I've talked to hospital administrators in rural communities in Iowa who say that they're facing that same challenge. And in some cases have told me, it's not a matter of years, it may be a matter of months before we have to make the decision to close the doors. So in that larger challenge that affects rural communities, and Pinky, I love that you mentioned, you said not just white rural communities, but all rural communities. And it's not just something we see in Texas or border states, it's something I'm seeing in Iowa, communities of immigrants who in many cases are reviving these rural communities. If you cannot get health care, including some of the health care that Andrea is talking about, you're not going to make it, and you're not going to make it. So in our America, we increase the Medicare reimbursement rates for rural communities. It's one of the things that I hear from doctors and clinic and hospital administrators, that they literally just cannot afford to exist on current reimbursement rates, compounded in Iowa by privatization of Medicaid in the state, something that we would end in our administration and under our plan. So making that investment in rural healthcare generally, I think, is going to be very, very helpful. And then specifically to some of the questions that you asked, I mean, I'm going to have to follow your guidance and the guidance of physicians and public health officials. But I've been reading about, back to this idea on naloxone, some doctors have, and correct me if I've got the terminology wrong, issued these standing orders for pharmacists and pharmacies so that naloxone is more accessible at the counter, and there's not as much wait time or distance traveled to be able to get that help that you need in the case of naloxone that you might need urgently. In some of these other prescribed substances, would love to work with you and medical providers to understand what, if any, model that might provide for us, where you have a doctor who might be able to cover that region, who can work in concert with the pharmacist, make sure that substance is available to the person who needs it so that they don't have to drive 2 or 3 hours. Make sure that, again, in Medicare for America, that there's no question and no copay for a person who needs that life-saving help. But I think that the specific policy has to be guided by those who understand this, and in my opinion, that would be those providers and public health experts who've been working on this issue, including yourself. And so, yeah, on those special X waivers, would just love to have your help to become smarter on that as a candidate, and I hope smarter as a president.
I want to thank you for your plan today as well, which I know goes into a little bit more detail about this, but certainly from the language used in the plan, it sounds like you are a candidate that's likely to be one that would support removal of the X waiver for buprenorphine. Although I know that's not the language verbatim in the plan, I appreciate your openness to removal of that. I know as a future addiction medicine physician, look forward to being able to prescribe those medications with ease rather than with a lot of bureaucracy surrounding my practice. I know that we have time for just one more question, and we want to give you some more opportunity to ask questions of us and for other folks in the room to ask you questions. And I know we haven't had a lot of personal discussion and about our own experiences in this conversation. So I want to ask you a question about something that's focused on your plan, but I want to preface it with more of a story. And so last year, I know you've noticed we have the El Cosmico poster here. And so last year, Andy, my partner, and I went and we celebrated our 30th birthdays at El Cosmico. I had a really great vacation there over New Year's for a whole week. And a little while after, we decided, okay, we should probably get married. And so we got this ring, and we planned a wedding that we were going to have next July in Mexico. And now I have his ashes and his necklace here. And this experience is one that I think is uniquely painful, but it devastates a lot of people, right? And there's hundreds of thousands of people like me across the country who have this kind of unique kind of pain that comes from this very traumatic loss. And Andy was a particularly smart individual, and like many people who use drugs, he was very invested in staying alive. He had no interest in dying. There are many places in the United States that currently function as safe consumption spaces or safe injection facilities. And when Andy and I were able to travel, those are places that he would consistently use. Well, he was not a regular heroin user. He was someone who said, I want to die using heroin. Like, I do not want to live my entire life abstinent from all drugs. And that's the truth, is that Andy is one of hundreds of thousands of people who's never going to quit drugs. No matter how much treatment or help is available, that was his choice. And so I want to know, for people like him, who abstinence is unrealistic and not attainable, how will you support the creation of safe consumption spaces? Will you ask and instruct the DOJ to allow those facilities to open?
I think what you just did is the only way to achieve that policy outcome, with which I agree. But until someone understands how it has personally affected you, and as you just helped us to do, to see ourselves in you and to imagine a loved one in our lives who faces this same kind of choice, until we can get to that place, I think it's very hard to get to that outcome or to that policy goal. So yes, I support the position. I support, again, as with everything that we brought up, the science, the facts, the truth, the public health guidance that is so clear on this issue, on the questions you brought up about syringes, or Andrew, you may have brought it up on syringes. The answers are pretty clear, but after 50 years of this war and the programming that has made us see people who use drugs as somehow defective or deficient or dysfunctional, to be able to see them as human beings and deserving of lives of dignity and being treated with respect. That's a lot of work, but you're doing that work right now, and I can imagine it's incredibly painful for you to share that story, and yet you're sharing it to bring me and others in to the solution that you want to see, so that fewer people have to experience that suffering in their lives. So you asked a specific question. The answer to it is yes, but I just want to tell you what I think it's going to take us to get there. On its face, it's very hard for a lot of people, as you know better than I do, to accept that that's something that this country could do. But I think only when you think about it in terms, can you begin to change the mindset and the opinions and what is politically possible in this country. And one of the things that I hope to do in my life is, when we know the truth, as difficult as it might be that we say it, when we know what the goal is, as politically impossible as it may seem at the moment, we define it, and then we do everything that we can to bring the country there and hope that the politics will follow. And we've done that on the way we talk about guns, we've done that in the way that we talk about foundational and institutional racism in this country. We've done that on a number of issues, and I really would love to be a leader in doing that on this issue. Would love to have your help and the help of others who are willing to tell their personal stories that bring our fellow Americans in. I think that's what it's going to take at the end of the day.
I know we're running out of time, so I want to ask you if you have any closing thoughts, or others if they have closing thoughts or further comments.
My closing thought will just to be to say thank you and to express my gratitude for this opportunity, and to each of you personally for the work that you're doing that is going to help us to get to some of the goals and outcomes that we described earlier, and look forward to being able to continue to work with you, and would very much, if you have any closing comments, would love to hear them.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, I was very grateful to do it. Thank you.
I want to thank you too as well, and I know I said this at the beginning of our conversation, but it does mean an incredible amount. I think you were the only candidate thus far in this presidential race for the Democratic nomination to set foot in a harm reduction organization, and so we appreciate your boldness in coming to lend your support to the work that we do, via your presence. I also want to thank AIDS United, the Harm Reduction Coalition, and the Drug Policy Alliance for their support of the work that we're doing throughout this series, and so we look forward to having these conversations with other candidates leading up to the Iowa caucus. So thank you as well to everyone who's watching on Instagram and on Facebook Live.
Word. Great. Thank you for doing this. Wow. You really important things into really short conversations. Amazing.
I appreciate it.